Let's begin by imagining a world without backpacks, lunchboxes, chalkboards, or even the idea of childhood as we know it today. In the Middle Ages, there was no national school system, no school buses picking children up at 7 a.m., and certainly no standardized exams. Education wasn't a right. It was a rare opportunity. Most medieval children, especially those from peasant families, never saw the inside of a classroom. Their education came from the fields, the barn, the home, and the rhythm of village life. But for the lucky, or perhaps unlucky few, formal schooling was a path that would shape their lives, sometimes painfully so. In this video, we're going to travel back in time to explore what school was really like for children in medieval Europe. Who went? What did they learn? How were they treated? And what legacy did this system leave behind? Grab your parchment and quill. We're going back in time. The first thing to understand is that education in the Middle Ages was not universal. Your access to learning depended on your social class, gender, location, and religion. In short, school was a luxury. For the vast majority of people, peasants, laborers, small traders, school was not part of their world. Boys and girls in poor families were expected to work from an early age. A peasant boy might help plow fields, herd animals, or carry water by the time he was 6 or 7. Girls would help with cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, or taking care of younger siblings. To these families, education didn't seem necessary. What mattered was learning how to survive. The story was different for the upper classes. Noble boys were expected to be literate, especially if they were to enter government diplomacy or the clergy. Many were taught at home by tutors. Later, they might be sent to a monastic or cathedral school, or to serve as pages in noble households where they learned manners, warfare, and courtly behavior in addition to reading and writing. Noble girls, on the other hand, might learn basic literacy, especially religious texts, but were more often trained in domestic skills, embroidery, music, household management, and the art of being a proper lady. If there was one institution that shaped medieval education, it was the church. Nearly all formal schooling took place in religious settings, and most teachers were clergy, monks, priests, or other church officials, because the church held both the knowledge and the infrastructure. Monasteries had libraries, writing rooms, and centuries of preserved knowledge. Cathedrals served as cultural and administrative centers. And most importantly, religious leaders believed that education served God's purpose. This meant that the content of education was heavily religious. Latin prayers, Bible passages, the writings of church fathers. Literacy meant being able to read Latin. And by Latin, we don't mean conversation. Medieval Latin was written, formal, and often incomprehensible to anyone outside the educated elite. To be educated in the Middle Ages was to be trained in the service of God. Even when secular subjects were taught, they were often framed within a religious worldview. Now let's break down the kinds of schools that existed in the medieval world. Contrary to popular belief, there wasn't one model. These were the earliest and most traditional. Found within monasteries, monastic schools were meant to train young boys for the monastic life. That meant strict discipline, religious instruction, and a heavy focus on memorization. Lessons began before sunrise with prayer. Classes were conducted in Latin. Students sat on wooden benches and wrote on wax tablets with styluses. Paper was rare and expensive. More advanced than monastic schools, cathedral schools were usually attached to a bishop's seat. They often accepted boys training for the priesthood, but sometimes also educated nobles or sons of wealthy merchants. These schools were the precursors to medieval universities. Subjects included grammar, rhetoric, logic, and theology, the so-called trivium, which formed the foundation of medieval liberal arts. Music played an essential role in medieval worship, and some boys were trained specifically to sing in choirs. Song schools taught hymns, Gregorian chants, and the reading of musical notation. As towns grew and literacy became more important, grammar schools emerged in the later Middle Ages, especially in England. These schools focused on Latin grammar and literature and were open to boys who could pay or who were sponsored by patrons or guilds. What did a typical school day look like? It started early, very early. Students were expected to rise with the sun or even before. There were no weekends and very few holidays apart from religious feasts. The classroom was usually a cold stone room with narrow windows. Heating was minimal or non-existent, and students often studied in their cloaks to keep warm. There were no desks. Pupils might sit on wooden stools or benches. If they were lucky, they had a wooden board or wax tablet for writing. Ink and parchment were reserved for advanced students or special assignments. The day began with prayers followed by recitation. Students learned by repeating aloud after the teacher. Memorization was everything. Writing was rare and books were expensive. There might be one textbook for the whole class, and the teacher would read from it while the students listened, copied, and repeated. Lunch was simple: bread, maybe some cheese. There were no cafeterias, and food had to be brought from home or provided by the church. The afternoon continued with more recitation, grammar drills, and sometimes singing. The day ended with another round of prayers. It was long, repetitive, and often cold and uncomfortable. But the biggest challenge wasn't the physical environment, it was the discipline. Medieval education was not child-friendly. Teachers were often strict, and corporal punishment was normal, even encouraged. Disobedient students might be hit with a rod, beaten with a stick, or forced to kneel on stone floors for hours. Failing to memorize a passage or mispronouncing Latin could result in physical punishment. Why so harsh? The belief was that the body needed to be disciplined so the soul could grow. Pain was seen as a teacher and silence as a virtue. There was no concept of learning styles or emotional development. Children were expected to obey, endure, and absorb knowledge through repetition and fear. This strictness wasn't limited to school, it was part of a broader medieval worldview, where hierarchy, submission, and suffering were seen as natural and necessary. We've talked a lot about boys, but what about girls? Did they have access to school at all? The sad truth is, most girls were excluded from formal education. For the average peasant girl, education meant learning from her mother how to cook, spin wool, care for children, and manage a home. Reading or writing? Almost unheard of. Among noble families, a few girls received private tutoring, especially in reading religious texts. They might learn to read Latin but not speak or write it fluently. Education was seen as a way to make them more pious, not more powerful. But there was one exception: convents. Girls who became nuns or were placed in convents could sometimes receive a surprisingly good education. Some learned to read, write, copy manuscripts, and even engage with theological ideas. A few women in medieval Europe, like Hildegard of Bingen, even became respected writers and thinkers. Still, these were exceptions, not the rule. In the medieval worldview, a woman's role was in the household, not the classroom. Classes were held in Latin. Professors lectured from raised pulpits, while students took notes on wax tablets or parchment if they could afford it. There were no textbooks, just copies of ancient manuscripts. Exams weren't multiple choice. They were oral disputations where you had to argue your ideas in front of your teachers and peers. It was brutal, but brilliant. The university system of the Middle Ages laid the groundwork for everything from degrees and academic titles to the structure of modern colleges. And even though only men were allowed, the very idea of organized formal learning became a cornerstone of Western civilization. In the 15th century, a German inventor named Johannes Gutenberg created the printing press, and the age of handwritten scrolls came to an end. Books became cheaper. Knowledge began to spread faster. Education slowly began to escape the grip of the church and reach the towns, cities, and even homes. For the first time in history, students could own books. Schools began to multiply. Literacy rates rose. This didn't happen overnight, but the seeds were sown. A literate middle class began to emerge. Education was no longer just for monks, priests, and nobles. Thanks to the printing press, the medieval dream of education, structured, preserved, sacred, would evolve into the Renaissance vision of learning, expansive, creative, and human. When we think about medieval schools, it's easy to focus on the hardship, the cold rooms, the discipline, the Latin drills. But underneath all that, something truly lasting was built. The medieval world gave us the first universities, the structure of liberal arts education, and even the academic robe and cap still worn at graduations today. The trivium and quadrivium were more than just old-fashioned subjects. They were a blueprint for teaching people how to think logically, argue clearly, and see the world through structure and meaning. The strict order and memorization may seem outdated, but they helped preserve ancient texts, train generations of scholars, and pass on knowledge through centuries of war, disease, and collapse. Without the foundations laid in these early schools and monasteries, the Renaissance might never have happened. The scientific revolution might have come too late, and our modern understanding of philosophy, law, and medicine might have looked very different. So while medieval education was far from perfect, it kept the light of learning burning in one of the darkest periods of human history. Let's stop for a second and ask, would you survive school in the Middle Ages? Could you rise before sunrise, sit motionless on a wooden bench all day? Memorize pages of Latin without understanding a word? Endure silence, discipline, cold, and humiliation? All for the chance to read a book? There were no snow days, no lunch breaks with friends, no creativity, no drawing, no freedom to ask why. And yet, for those who endured it, this kind of education meant a chance at influence, at respect, at power. Clerks, priests, scribes, doctors, even kings, many of them came from these harsh beginnings. So ask yourself not just if you'd survive, but if you'd thrive. Yes, medieval education was harsh and limited, but let's not ignore what it got right. There's something humbling about a world where a child might study for years just to copy one sacred manuscript and feel proud of it. In a time without distractions, learning was slow but deep. Painful, yes, but meaningful. Perhaps we, with all our digital tools and smart devices, could learn from that kind of focus. Education in the Middle Ages began in the shadows, behind monastery walls with one candle lighting a dozen boys chanting Latin in unison. But from that darkness came light. Ideas survived, logic was taught, books were preserved, and slowly, over centuries, knowledge was handed down. Until one day, a new world emerged. A world of inquiry, science, discovery, and freedom. So the next time you sit in a classroom or scroll through a digital textbook, remember this. The journey began with a monk, a book, and a student. In the cold. So you've made it to the end of our journey through medieval education. You've walked through cold stone classrooms, whispered Latin verses by candlelight, and endured the weight of discipline. But before we part ways, let's take a deeper moment. Something more than a simple outro. Let's reflect on why this story still matters today. The Middle Ages weren't just a dark void between the glories of Rome and the brilliance of the Renaissance. They were a time of preservation, transformation, and human effort. For nearly 1,000 years, generation after generation carried the fragile flame of knowledge across wars, plagues, and chaos, so that one day we might carry it forward. This is the story of how we as a civilization refuse to forget. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you never miss a medieval mystery. Because history isn't boring. It's brutal, beautiful, and very much alive. Thanks for watching.